Today I'll be telling you the strategic story of travelers lost in the cold of the Middle Ages. Please. And leave a comment. What happened to medieval travelers lost in a storm? In the autumn of a year in the late 14th century, a wool merchant named Edmund set out from a market town in the north of England, bound for a trading post 2 days' journey south before the roads closed for winter. He traveled with a hired guide, a weathered man named Alric, who had crossed these hills more times than he could count, and a young apprentice, barely 16, named Tom, who had begged to accompany his master on what he believed would be a simple, uneventful trip. None of them could have known that within 2 days, their names, had history recorded them at all, would join the long, largely unwritten list of medieval travelers who vanished into a winter storm and never came home. Edmund's journey began under conditions, by the standards of the period, seemed entirely reasonable for the season. Late autumn travel was common practice among merchants eager to complete final trades before winter made the roads genuinely dangerous, and Edmund, like most experienced merchants of his time, had made this same crossing in previous years without serious incident. His route would take the group across a stretch of high, exposed moorland, terrain that offered no villages, no monasteries, and no shelter of any kind for nearly 15 miles. A gap in settlement that experienced travelers like Alric knew to respect and plan around carefully, timing their crossing to avoid, wherever possible, being caught on the exposed ground as darkness or bad weather approached. On the second day of their journey, as the party began the long moorland crossing shortly after dawn, Alric noted something that gave him real pause. A peculiar stillness in the air, and clouds gathering through the west with a density and color he had learned through decades of crossing the same terrain to associate with serious trouble. Edmund, to seek shelter in a small hamlet they had passed the previous evening, rather than press forward into open country. But Edmund, mindful of his trading schedule and the genuine financial cost of delay, a concern entire TPP all of medieval merchants whose livelihoods depended on timely arrival at markets and fairs, chose to continue judging the risk acceptable based on the clearest skies still visible overhead at early hour. This tension between a guide's caution rooted in hard-won local knowledge and a merchant's practical need to maintain his schedule reflected a genuine and recurring dynamic documented across surviving medieval travel accounts, one that did not always resolve in favor of caution, since pressures of commerce were themselves entirely real and rarely simple to dismiss. By mid-morning, Ulrich's fears began to materialize. The wind shifted First, sharp and sudden, followed within the hour by the earliest flakes of what would become a severe storm. Exactly the kind of rapid, violent shift in mountain and moorland wetland weather that medieval travelers across Europe had learned, often through bitter experience, to fear above almost any other natural danger. Tom, the youngest of the group and least experienced with such conditions, grew visibly frightened. As visibility began to drop, the familiar landmarks Auric relied upon for navigation disappearing one by one into the thickening snow. Edmund Trednet did. But the practical reality of their situation was now undeniable. They were roughly 7 miles from the nearest known shelter in either direction, exposed on open moorland, with the storm intensifying around them by the minute. Ulrich's response to this crisis reflected the accumulated practical knowledge that experienced medieval guides carried, knowledge built from years of first-hand experience rather than any formal training, but no less valuable for its informal origins. Rather than attempting to push forward blindly through worsening conditions, choice that surviving accounts of similar situations suggest often led to fatal disorientation. Ulrich made the decision to seek immediate, if imperfect, shelter, leading Edmund and Emmet Tom toward key outcrop he remembered from previous crossings, a formation that, while offering no true structure, provided at least a partial break from the direct force of the wind, now driving snow almost horizontally across the east. This decision, prioritizing immediate protection from wind chill over continued forward progress toward uncertain shelter, matched the documented practical wisdom that experienced medieval travelers across many regions understood, even winning without any formal scientific framework, for why wind exposure so dramatically worsened the danger of cold. Reaching the outcrop, the three travelers faced the immediate practical work of improving their shelter as much as possible with the limited resources available to them. Ulrich directed Tom to help pack snow against the exposed sides of the rock formation, a technique that used snow's genuine insulating properties to create a more effective windbreak than the bare rock alone provided. Work to keep their single-pack horse-com crews crucially positioned close enough to the group that its body heat could contribute meaningfully to their collective warmth, a practical strategy well understood among experienced medieval travelers who depended on horses and pack animals for exactly this kind of emergency assistance when formal shelter could not be reached in time. As the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no sign of easing, the psychological strain of their situation began to test each member of the group differently, reflecting patterns of behavior behavior, and vulnerability that surviving medieval accounts of storm survival describe with notable consistency. Across otherwise very different individual cases. Tom, exhausted and frightened, began to grow unnervingly quiet, a change that the Ulrich recognized immediately, and with genuine alarm as a warning sign rather than simple calm, since the deceptive stillness that often preceded the most dangerous stages of hypothermia was precisely the kind of symptom experienced travelers learn to watch for and actively counter, even when doing so meant forcing an exhausted, resistant companion to remain alert and moving against their own immediate wishes. Insisted that Tom continued talking, moving his hands and feet, and remain engaged with the group, rather than allowing himself to drift into the passive, sleepy state that his exhausted body increasingly seemed to crave. Edmund, for his part, turned to prayer as the hours passed, a response entirely consistent with the genuine religious framework through which medieval cavaliers commonly understood and coped with mortal danger. Invoking Saint Christopher, the patron widely associated with protection for travelers, and reciting familiar prayers, whatever their theological content, provided Edmund with a structured, familiar mental discipline to focus on rather than succumbing entirely to fear during the storm's most frightening hours. As dusk approached, deepening the already severe visibility problems the storm had created, Auric made a decision that reflected genuine, sound judgment, even though its outcome would ultimately prove tragic. Rather than continuing to wait passively at the outcrop. Full darkness and worsening cold made their position genuinely untenable. He chose to attempt a careful, deliberate movement toward a shepherd's shelter he believed lay roughly 2 miles distant, a modest stone structure used seasonally by local herders, and, he believed, familiar enough to him from years crossing this locate even in under severely reduced visibility. Navigating by a combination of the wind's consistent direction, careful counting of paces, and the kind of accumulated terrain memory that experienced medieval guides developed repeated it to the same routes across many years of work. It was, by any reasonable measure, the correct decision to attempt. The storm, however, had already begun to alter the very landmarks Auric's memory depended upon. Drifting snow reshaping familiar contours of the land into something his experience alone could no longer reliably read. The journey toward the shelter tested every reserve of strength and resolve the 3 travelers possessed, and it was during this attempt that their fortune, which had held through the long afternoon at Outcrop, began finally to turn against them. Tom, still dangerously petite, despite Eitz Ulrich's earlier intervention, required genuine physical support to continue moving. Edmund taking his apprentice's arm and forcibly maintaining near pair pace, even as exhaustion made every step struggle. The horse, sensing the group's evident distress and increasingly unable to find sure footing beneath the deepening drifts, grew difficult to manage, and somewhere in the swirling, disorienting whiteness, in a moment none of the three could later have precisely explain, even had they lived to try. The group lost the line Ulrich had been so carefully counting, the wind's direction shifting, supped enough, in the storm's chaotic final hour of daylight, to carry them gradually off the path toward safety and onto open, unsheltered ground they did not recognize. By the time full darkness fell, Ulrich was forced to admit, first to himself, and then, with evident and uncharacteristic difficulty, to Edmund, that he no longer knew with certainty where the shelter lay, nor how far they had drifted from the route he had intended. The temperature, already severe, dropped further as the wind continued unabated, and the practical options available to the three travelers narrowed with brute speed to the same grim choice faced by countless medieval travelers for them in exactly this circumstance. Continue moving blindly through darkness and storm in the hope of stumbling upon shelter by chance, or stop, huddled together as closely as the horses remaining warmed allowed, and out, and attempt to simply endure until dawn might offer enough light to reorient themselves, a choice that surviving medieval accounts of similar crisis suggest carried genuine, roughly comparable risk in either direction, since both continued movement in blinding darkness and prolonged stillness in severe, unrelenting cold posed serious, well-documented dangers as to exhausted bodies already pushed well past their limits. Ulrich chose stillness, judging with the same hard-earned practical wisdom that had guided every decision that day. That blind movement in full darkness risked a fall, an injury, or completed disorientation that would make their situation immediately and irreversibly worse. The three travelers pressed themselves against the horse and against one another. Tom between the two men in a deliberate arrangement meant to shield the group's most vulnerable member from the worst of the wind, and settled in to endure what remained of the night. Strength allowed the practices that had sustained them through the afternoon, forced movement of hands and feet, continued conversation to ward off the dangerous, creeping, stooping stillness of advancing hypothermia, and from Edmund, continued prayer, though his voice, as the night wore on, grew increasingly faint and halting. It was Tom who succumbed first, sometime in the deep, coldest hours before what would have been dawn, his exhausted young body already weakened by the earlier hours of fear and struggle. Finally overcome by a cold that no amount of forced movement or encouragement could hold off any longer, the same deceptive, peaceful stillness Ulrich had fought so hard to prevent throughout the previous day finally, quietly claiming him despite every effort made against it. Ulrich, whose decades of experience had carried the group through so much of that terrible day, followed not long afterward, his own aged body, all its accumulated wisdom and skill. Ultimately no match for a night of such sustained, severe exposure. Edmund, alone now in the final hours before the storm at last began to ease, continued his prayers to the very end, his own strength failing gradually in the same manner that had taken his companions. The merchant's journey that had begun with such ordinary, practical urgency, ending instead in the silent, frozen stillness that claimed so many medieval travelers whose stories, unlike this one, were never recorded or remembered at all. Their bodies were found 4 days later by a shepherd from the very hamlet Ulrich had once urged Edmund to shelter in, discovered within sight, cruelly, of a low ridge that, had the storm's darkness and confusion not intervened, would have revealed the shepherd's shelter itself, no more than half a mile from where the 3 travelers had finally stopped. This deity's hail, when it reached the ears of the local parish priest who oversaw their burial, and later the small market town where Edmund's family and business associates learned of his fate, became, in the way such details often did in medieval accounts of tragedy, a source of particular, sorrowful reflection, a stark illustration of how narrow and arbitrary the margin between Swin's survival and death could prove even for travelers who had done nearly everything within their power correctly. The parish records that noted their burial, brief and administrative in the manner typical of such documents, listed simply the names of the deceased, the proximate date and circumstances of their deaths, and the modest arrangements made for their burial in the nichyard, archyard, unembellished. Record entirely consistent with how medieval communities across Europe documented the countless similar tragedies that winter's storms inflicted upon travelers, whose only fault had often been the simple, unavoidable necessity of being on the road when the weather turned. Edmund's widow, left to manage what remained of his modest trading business, and Tom's family, who had entrusted their son to what they had reasonably believed was a safe and well-guided apprenticeship journey. We both faced the genuine, practical hardship that a medieval household commonly confronted. Following the unexpected death of a primary earner or a promising young family member, a hardship that surviving wills, court records, and parish accounts from across medieval Europe document with sobering regularity as one of the ordinary, recurring consequences of winter's dangerous grip on travel and trade. Alric, without immediate family of his own, recorded in the surviving account, was remembered locally in the informal way such things were preserved before they faded entirely from living memory, as a guide whose skill and judgment had been genuinely sound, whose fatal misfortune reflected not any failure of competence, but the simple, brutal unpredictability of a storm severe enough to erase even a lifetime of accumulated knowledge of the land, a fact that offered the surrounding community what limited comfort such an explanation could provide, even as it did nothing to change the outcome that a shift of wind, a half-mile of unrecognized ground, and a handful of the night's coldest hours had ultimately, irreversibly sided. To understand why Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom found themselves on that particular stretch of moorland at that particular moment, and why their deaths, though tragic, reflected an entirely recognizable pattern rather than any unusual or exceptional misfortune, it helps to look more closely at each of them actually was. Edmund, then in his early 40s, had built his modest trading business over nearly 2 decades, dealing primarily in raw wool, purchased from sheep farmers across the northern hill country and sold onward to weavers, merchants in larger market towns, a trade that formed the backbone of the English medieval economy, and that required exactly this kind of regular, seasonal travel between scattered, rural sources and more centralized markets. His decision to press forward, despite Ulrich's warning, reflected not recklessness, but the genuine, calculated risk-taking that characterized medieval commerce more broadly. Since a missed trading queen window, could mean that the difference between a profitable year and genuine financial hardship for his family, a pressure that surviving merchant records and correspondence from the period document as a constant underlying feature of medieval trading life, one that, in Edmund's case, ultimately proved to carry a far higher cost than any missed sale ever could have. Considerably older than Edmund at nearly 60, represented a figure well documented in medieval sources concerned with travel and trade. The professional guide, hired specifically for intimate, hard-won knowledge of dangerous terrain that no amount of general travel experience could substitute for. Men like Ulrich typically came from families, generations of experience in a particular region, often supplementing seasonal shepherding or farming work with guide services during the periods when merchants and other travelers most needed such expertise, and surviving town and guild records occasionally document payments specifically made to such local guides, confirming that Edmund's decision to hire Ulrich for this crossing reflected entirely standard, prudent practice among experienced medieval merchants undertaking journeys across genuinely hazardous terrain. That even a guide of Ulrich's evident skill and caution could ultimately be defeated by the storm's severity, a sobering truth, well understood, if rarely stated so plainly, among medieval communities that depended on such guides. Experience reduced risk considerably, but it could not eliminate it entirely, and the same storm that a guide's skill successfully navigated 9 times out of 10 might prove simply too severe for any amount of accumulated knowledge to overcome. Tom's presence on the journey reflected the equally common evil medieval institution of apprenticeship, through which a young person, typically beginning in their early teenage years, would be bound to a master craftsman or merchant for a period of years, learning the practical business alongside their formal training in exchange for labor and assistance during exactly this kind of journey. Tom's death, at barely 16 years of age, would have struck his surviving family and community with the particular, well-documented grief that medieval sources reserved for the loss of the young, a grief distinct from, though no less genuine than, the sorrow attached to the deaths of the older Edmund and Ulrich, since surviving wills, peerage records, and personal correspondence from the period consistently reflect a heightened sense of tragedy specifically associated with young lives cut short before they could reach their expected span, even within a medieval world where child and youth mortality remained, by later standards, tragically common. The shepherd, who eventually discovered free bodies, a man named Wulfric, who had tended flocks on that same stretch of moorland for most of his own adult life, brought word of the tragedy back to the hamlet, setting in motion the practical, procedural response that medieval communities typically applied to such discoveries. And increasingly, by late 14th century, formal legal requirement called for the involvement of the coroner, Aranor, unofficial, whose race responsibilities included investigating sudden or unexplained deaths. A system that had developed steadily across medieval England from the late 12th century onwards, specifically to ensure that deaths occurring outside the ordinary course of illness or old age received at least a basic level of official documentation and inquiry. The coroner's inquest into the deaths of Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom would have followed an entirely standard procedure for such cases. Local jury of neighboring men examining the bodies and circumstances of their discovery, and ultimately accurately recording a verdict attributing the deaths to misadvenge. This standard legal categorization applied to accidental deaths as exactly this kind. A designation that carried no suggestion of blame or wrongdoing, but simply confirmed, for the formal record, that no foul play or negligence beyond ordinary, accepted risks of winter travel had contributed to the tragedy. Reached Edmund's trading partners and business associates in the market town within roughly a week, carried by the same informal networks of travelers and messengers that ordinarily conveyed commercial news and correspondence across medieval England, and the practical financial consequences of Edmund's death began unfolding almost immediately, since medieval commerce depended heavily on personal relationships, extended credit, and reputation, all of which a merchant's sudden death threw into genuine, immediate uncertainty. Surviving records from similar cases suggest that Edmund's outstanding debts and obligations would have required careful sorting by his surviving family, Emily, and business associates, a process complicated by the reality that some of the goods and payments involved in his fatal journey may themselves have been lost or never properly accounted for, adding a further practical layer of hardship to the emotional loss his family and community Harry suffered. The parish priest who oversaw the burial of all the 3 travelers in the churchyard of the very hamlet Alric had once urged Edmund to shelter in would have followed the established rites appropriate to their circumstances, though the specific manner of their deaths, exposure during ordinary travel, rather than through any suggestion of sin or spiritual failing, meant they received burial without the particular restrictions and complications that medieval canon law attached to certain other categories of death, such as suicide, ensuring that Edmund, Alric, and Tom were laid to rest within consecrated ground with the full customary rites their community and faith prescribed, a small but genuinely meaningful comfort that their families and neighbors would have understood as important within the broader medieval framework governing death, burial, and the fate of the soul. In the debts of Edmund, Alric, and Tom would likely have taken on a particular, lasting significance within the local memory of the hamlet and surrounding region, entering the kind of informal oral tradition that surviving folklore studies instance suggest preserved countless similar local tragedies long after the formal administrative records of coroners' inquests and parish burials had faded from active use or been lost entirely. Shepherds and travelers that same stream stretch of moorland in subsequent years particularly during the approach of a threatening snowstorm, may well have invoked the memory of the three travelers. As a practitionary example, a practical, remembered lesson about the specific dangers of that particular terrain woven into the accumulated local knowledge that guides like Ulrich had once carried, and that his own death, in a certain grim irony well suited to how such stories were often preserved and retold, may itself have contributed to updating and reinforcing for the next generation of travelers and guys who crossed that ground after him the broader pattern their deaths represented. One repeated with quiet, largely unrecorded regularity across the medieval landscape, wherever winter's dangerous, unpredictable weather met travelers whose preparation, however genuine and well considered, ultimately proved insufficient against a storm of unusual severity, offers a necessary counterweight to any account of medieval winter travel that focuses solely on stories of successful survival. For every well-documented tale of travelers who reached shelter in time, I'd guide by skill, sound judgment, or simple fortune, historical demography, and the scattered, terraced records of coroners and parish priests suggest that comparable, largely unrecorded number met instead the fate that claimed Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom, their individual stories reduced, in the surviving historical record, to little more than a name, a date, and a brief administrative notation of misadventure that stood, in the end, as the only formal acknowledgement medieval bureaucracy generally offered to the countless personal tragedies that its winters, storm after storm, year after year, quietly and repeatedly inflicted upon travelers, whose only true failing had been the simple, unavoidable necessity of being caught upon the road when the weather finally, decisively turned against them. It is worth pausing on the specific choices Ulrich made throughout that final day, not to assign blame in hindsight, a judgment the surviving historical pattern of such cases generally resists, but to understand more clearly just how narrow and unforgiving the margin. Medieval travelers facing conditions of this severity. Ulrich's initial instinct to delay departure had been sound. His choice to seek the rocky outcrop rather than continue blindly forward had been sound. His insistence on keeping Tom alert and moving had been sound. And even his final decision to attempt the shelter rather than remain indefinitely exposed at the rock crop reflected careful, reasonable judgment based on the information available to him at the time. It was not any single failure of skill or judgment that ultimately doomed the three travelers, but rather the simple, compounding accumulation of a genuinely severe storm's unpredictable effects, layered atop hours of exhausting exposure that had already worn down each traveler's physical reserves. Well, before the final fatal misdirection occurred, a pattern entirely consistent with how modern understanding of hypothermia, and cold weather survival describes the way sound decisions made under conditions of extreme physical depletion can still fail to produce a safe outcome, since exhaustion itself depredates judgment and physical capability in ways that even the most experienced traveler cannot always fully counteract through willpower alone. This distinction between a genuine failure of skill or preparation and simple tragic misfortune compounded across a day of otherwise sound decisions mattered a great deal to how medieval communities themselves understood and processed such deaths, reflected it in the specific language and framework of the coroner's verdict of misadventure already discussed. A legal and moral category that explicitly acknowledged death occurring despite reasonable care rather than because of its absence. Surviving medieval attitudes towards such tragedies, expressed through parish records, occasional personal correspondence, and the broader religious framework through which death was generally understood, suggest a community capable of holding both genuine grief and a clear-eyed, unsentimental acceptance that some dangers, winter's most severe storms very much included, simply exceeded what human skill and preparation, however genuine, could reliably overcome. An acceptance that did not diminish the sorrow felt by Edmund's widow, Tom's grieving parents, or the wider community that had known and respected Ulrich's decades of careful, skilled guiding work, but that nonetheless allowed medieval society to continue sending mending merchants, guides, and apprentices out along those same dangerous roads each subsequent autumn, understanding the risk clearly while judging it, on balance, a risk that the ordinary business of medieval life required them to continue accepting. The pack horse that had accompanied the three travelers throughout their final day deserves its own brief but genuine acknowledgement within this account, since surviving wrecking records of similar incidents suggest the animal's fate often coined closely with that of the human travelers it served. Its own body, heat, and, at times, its own life, offering the final measure of protection available to exhausted, freezing companions. Whether Edmund's horse survived the night that claimed its three human companions wandering free once its riders could no longer manage it, or perished alongside them, unable itself to withstand the same severe, sustained cold. The surviving pattern of such medieval accounts suggests either outcome was entirely plausible, and Wulfric's eventual discovery of the scene, whatever specific details he encountered regarding the animal, would have represented simply one further practical element of the tragedy requiring the same basic documentation and disposition that govern the treatment of the human remains, since are valuable animal, alive or dead, itself represented property, requiring proper accounting within Edmund's surviving estate. Reflecting on the full arc of Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom's final journey from the ordinary, practical calculations that shaped their departure, through the mounting series of genuinely sound decisions made under conditions of increasing danger and exhaustion, RJ unreclarent that ultimately claimed all three within the same terrible night, offers a portrait of medieval winter danger, considerably more textured, ensured, and human than the simple, abstract statistics of seasonal mortality that survive in aggregate across manorial and parish records. Their story, however, reconstructed from typical rather than singularly documented circumstances, embodies the genuine, specific human stakes that stood behind every one of the countless similar tragedies scattered across the historical record of medieval Europe's relationship with its own harsh, deeply practical culture of respect and fear that medieval society as a whole maintained toward the genuine, recurring danger that winter's most severe storms represented year after year. For as long as travelers continued to need the roads that wound across Europe's exposed, unsheltered, and in the wrong storm, genuinely deadly open country. Beyond the specific fate of Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom, their story invites a broader reflection on how differently medieval society and modern audiences tend to approach the concept of acceptable risk. A difference worth examining directly, rather than simply assuming one perspective naturally supersedes the other. Modern readers, accustomed to weather forecasting, rapid emergency communication, and organized search and rescue services entirely unavailable to medieval travelers, might reasonably view Edmund's initial decision to continue traveling despite Ulrich's warning as the clear, identifiable point where the tragedy became preventable. Yet this judgment, however understandable from a modern vantage point, imposes a standard of predictive certainty that simply did not exist within the medieval traveler's actual world. Ulrich's warning, however well founded in decades of accumulated experience, remained fundamentally a matter of informed probability, rather than certain knowledge. And surviving accounts of medieval travel consistently document countless journeys undertaken under similarly ambiguous warning signs that concluded without instant viewing that Edmund's decision, viewed within its own genuine historical context, rather than through the distorting clarity of hindsight, reflected an entirely reasonable weighing of uncertain risk against certain immediate commercial costs, precisely the kind of judgment call that medieval merchants made successfully thousands of times for every occasion when the outcome proved catastrophic. This distinction matters considerably for understanding the broader historical pattern that Edmund, Ulrich, and Tom's story represents, since medieval society's continued sustained reliance on winter travel, despite its genuine, well-documented dangers, reflected not naivety or recklessness on any collective scale, but rather a clear-eyed, practical calculation that the economic, religious, and social necessities driving such travel, trade, pilgrimage, communication, and the countless other purposes that sent medieval people onto dangerous roads throughout the winter months simply outweigh it. The real, but statistically limited danger that any single journey would end in tragedy. The historical record's mixture of both survival stories, like those documented extensively elsewhere in accounts of medieval travelers who successfully weathered severe storms, and tragic accounts, like the one reconstructed here, together represent not contradictory evidence, but two genuine, well-documented sides of the same underlying reality. That winter travel in medieval Europe carries real, serious risk that experienced, careful travelers successfully managed the great majority of the time and undaunted, and that occasionally, despite every reasonable precaution and every sound decision made in sequence, that risk resolved instead into the quiet, cold tragedy that closed over 3 travelers on an exposed stretch of English moorland on a night in the late 14th century, their names surviving now only within a reconstruction built from the countless documented cases that together allow their story and the stories of so many others like them be told with confidence in its essential historical truth, even where the specific individuals themselves remain, as they were for most of medieval history's ordinary people, otherwise a loss to time. Rear story, typical, well-documented pattern of circumstances, decisions, and outcomes that shaped countless similar medieval winter tragedies, rather than drawn from any single surviving historical account of specific named individuals, reflects the genuine, sobering reality that stood behind so many of the period's terse parish records and manorial notations of travelers found dead after a storm. That skill, experience, and courage, however genuine and however well applied, could reduce but never entirely eliminate the danger that a medieval winter storm posed to anyone caught upon the open road, and that for every traveler whose story ended, like Edmund's, in survival, another, equally deserving of sympathy and equally careful in their preparation. Instead, the cold, silent, and largely unrecorded fate that closed over Edmund and Tom on that exposed and unforgiving stretch of moorland, that the historical chord suggests was, for the medieval traveler facing wincing winter's harshest storms, never entirely a matter of choice. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment.